Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Kathryn Schulz, presenting her memoir, Lost and Found, joined in conversation by James Wood. Thank you for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Lost and Found on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we do thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Kathryn Schulz is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she's covered numerous topics and where she won a National Magazine Award and a Pulitzer Prize for her article, The Really Big One, about seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. She's the author of the book Being Wrong, and her writing has also appeared in the Best American Science and Nature Writing, the Best American Travel Writing, and the Best American Food Writing. Tonight, Kathryn will be joined by New Yorker staff writer and Harvard professor of the practice of literary criticism, James Wood. He's the author of many books, including How Fiction Works, The Book Against God, and Serious Noticing. These two will be discussing Kathryn's latest book, the memoir Lost and Found, which Vogue called a lively exploration of some of the strongest emotions we humans have the luck to feel, and a wondrous look at how they work in tandem. And the Boston Globe said that Schultz's mind flows beautifully on the page. Hers is a nimble and profoundly humane mind, capable of carrying the various threads of her thinking onward without losing the integrity of the fabric she's creating. We're so happy to have them both here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, James and Kathryn.
Mute myself. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure, a real treat to be here talking to Kathryn Schulz. And I just finished Lost and Found this afternoon. I don't know how many of our audience have read the book. It's not exactly, we're not giving stuff away when we discuss it. But I will say that it's a fantastically powerful and moving book. And in some ways, the passages about love are more moving even than the passages about grief. I ended the book in tears and just felt great gratitude, Kathryn, that you've written this book. So without further ado, I'd just like to, I think before, well, what I'd like to do is maybe I will just explain for audience members, just very briefly describe the book, and then I'd love, if you wouldn't mind, if you would just read a few pages out to us, and then we can discuss, because the prose is so beautiful. Lost and Found, as the title suggests, is profoundly about losing and finding, and in this case about losing a father at the age of 74. Is when Isaac Schultz died, and finding a lover and then a wife, Casey Sepp. Not in that order, in fact. Kathryn met Casey before her father died, but the order of the book is, as it were, grief first, then finding love, and it's up to us in some ways as readers, guided by Kathryn's intelligence, to unite these two great apprehensions of being alive. So with that said, I'd love you, if you wouldn't mind, Kathryn, just to read some pages, whatever you'd like, to us.
Oddly, that's one of the hardest questions anyone's asked me so far. James, can you point me to any passage, even a section of the book, some part you'd like me to read?
I'm very moved by all the sort of courtship on the Hudson stuff. I think that's lovely and wonderful. But I'm also moved by the more philosophical passages at the end about the inevitability of loss and opening oneself up to that and balancing gratitude with fear.
Sure, I'll pick a passage that somehow gets at both love and grief, kind of towards the end of the book. But before I start reading, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget to do this, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to thank everybody who is sitting in front of a laptop right now looking at this. It is a source of ongoing astonishment to me that 2 years into this pandemic, there are still people who are willing to log onto a Zoom and give their evening over to this incredibly strange form of human interaction. So I'm profoundly grateful to you. I'm also incredibly grateful to Harvard Bookstore for hosting this event. I love those folks. They've already been huge champions of this book, and I want to return the favor and try to champion them a little bit. You know, bookstores like Harvard go to great ends to make events like this happen and to connect readers with authors in countless ways, including just by loving and recommending their books. So I really implore you, I know, if we were all in person tonight, you'd be browsing the bookstore, you might pick up something else by chance. Please, you don't need to buy my book tonight, and many of you might have already done so just as part of getting a ticket, but please buy something from Harvard to support them and help make it possible for them to keep being the truly tremendous pillar of this community that they are. And with that, I promise my moralizing is done for the evening. I mean, maybe, I guess I shouldn't promise that. James and I might well have a very morally grounded conversation, but my moralizing about independent bookstores is done. And I am going to read you a tiny passage chosen almost at random because I really did make James promise he would tell me what to read, and he didn't. So I've picked basically at random from this book, but we're towards the end, and all you need to know is that all my life I've been someone who was terribly afraid of losing the people I love. For whatever reason, I'm just wired to imagine catastrophe all the time. So when this passage happens, you already know that that I'm very in love. You already know that I have lost my father, someone else I love, and here I am meditating about the flip side of being in this relationship that I cherish and that sustains me in life, which is, knowing that it's like all things in life, it is inevitably not permanent. So I'm speaking of the possibility that my partner Casey, who for various reasons in the book I refer to as C, I'm speaking of the possibility that she could predecease me. She could die before me. Whether or not that comes to pass, however, the larger issue remains. We will each die, C and I, and in addition to the how and the when, we are now both afflicted with the lover's haunting question of which one of us will do so first. I imagine that many spouses have made each other unkeepable promises, have talked, as he and I have done, about dying together in very old age in our sleep, entering death as we have entered almost every night and morning of our shared life, holding each other close, grateful and at peace. Has any couple in the history of the world been so lucky? Perhaps one or two. But the odds are grievously against us. In all likelihood, one of us will leave the other alone in bed at night, alone on waking up to face the day. Me, if we go by actuarial tables, because I am older. C, if we go by premonitions, because she had one when she was a little girl about dying young. A story I wish she had never told me, because now and then it fills me with a dread as huge and as cold as the ocean. I do not want to die. It is impossible to overstate how true that is. But I would rather face my own death than survive hers. I cannot imagine that I will ever stop feeling this way, even if I am lucky and my fears for C prove as premature as my childhood ones for my parents, and we are still tending our wildflowers together half a century hence. Yet even in that case, I know how little balm, once the time comes, all that time will be. I have never forgotten a heartbreaking line in a letter I once received. How fortunate I have been, and yet I wanted it to last longer. That was from my great uncle, widowed after 62 years. If anything, like all shadows, this one that trails behind love grows longer later in the day. When I was a child, death seemed like a contingency, an emergency, even though I understood in the abstract that it would come for all of us eventually. But after my father died, I began to feel its inevitability, and I know that it will only grow more present with each passing year. We find things and lose things at all stages of life, but the overall distribution shifts over time, and loss strikes both more often and with more devastating intimacy as we age. And so the kind of difficulties we face shift as we grow older too. The first problem that love presents us with is how to find it. But the most enduring problem of love, which is also the most enduring problem of life, is how to live with the fact that we will lose it. I fear I've launched us off on a very grim note here.
No, that's very beautiful. Thank you very much. You actually chose exactly the passage that I was most moved by when I was finishing your book this afternoon. Before we get into the book, I just wanted to ask you a question about the writing of it, because one of the joys of reading it is a sense that one gets, whether accurate or not, that the writing was quite easy for you. There's a sense of ease, almost as if you wrote, and I know you didn't, because some of it, a portion of it appeared as a standalone piece in the New Yorker, presumably the first bit you wrote. But when one reads it as a book, it reads as if almost you wrote it in one breath, like a long essay in some ways, and that it's something about the free play of the intelligence on the page, the ratio of anecdote to generalization or theoretical consideration, whatever it is. It just seems as if it was easy to write. And I wanted to ask you about the writing of it and how long it took and whether it was easy.
Well, James, you're paying me a very high compliment, because I tend to believe that the mark of writing that I love, at least, is that it seems effortless, even though, as you and I both know, it almost never was. I think maybe a couple of writers can actually sound and act and also be effortless. I'm not one of them. That said, a lot of this book actually was easier to write than I would have expected, which is to say easier to write than most things are for me. I am not famously a contented, calm, swift, and productive writer. I don't think I'm at the very far end of angsty, but I don't generally think that writing is easy. I love it very much, but I find it difficult. And in the case of this book, I actually found, so as James was explaining, that the book is in 3 parts, which basically mirror the title. The first part is lost, the second part is found, and somewhat curiously, the third part is and, which is about the kind of emotional conjunction I was sort of gesturing towards in that passage I just read, the intimate relationship of love and grief. Found, that middle section, which is the love story, I have to say was kind of a delight to write. Which, some of that was just, it's a real pleasure to tell your love story. We all love to, right? We do it over drinks, oh, how'd you two meet? It's so delightful to talk about someone you love. And I really did just relish getting to put down on the page the texture and chronology of a relationship I count myself lucky every day to be in. So that was quite delightful, actually. And which should have been the hardest section, because it's conceptually the weirdest, was actually pretty smooth sailing too. Surprisingly, by far the hardest section was lost. I say surprisingly because, to your point, it did grow out of an essay that was already extant. I wrote it for the New Yorker as a standalone piece. So in some ways, it was the part of the book I thought about the most. In retrospect, I think that was some of the problem, meaning, it can be a little bit of a trap to have a perfectly polished pre-existing piece of writing that you're trying to develop into a book, because it just couldn't go into the book wholesale. I knew the book couldn't open the way the essay does. I knew it couldn't work the way the essay does. And I knew I had to kind of take a hammer to that original piece while retaining some of its contents. And first of all, that was just hard. I mean, I find writing difficult enough that destroying something I've written is not a fun prospect. But also I found this book incredibly hard to begin. It was not what you would imagine, like emotional difficulty about writing about the death of my father, which I don't want to diminish that, but that wasn't the obstacle. The obstacle was writerly, which was, how does this book start? And overall, my ratio of like stuff left on the cutting room floor to book was lower than in my usual writing process, which usually, for a magazine piece, I'm at like 150%. It's horrifying. But the book, this mostly wasn't that way, except for the beginning. I wrote a horrifying number of beginnings to this book before finding one that moderately works.
That's great. I mean, I don't know if it's great to hear. That last bit may not be great to hear, but it's generally great to hear, and that does comport with my sense, at least, there's a sense of enjoyment of you being able to, and doubtless some of it is also just the sense of enjoyment that comes for any magazine writer who isn't who's escaped the bounds of writing a piece. Suddenly you're able, there's not an editor breathing down your neck. The fact checkers haven't got their little guns out, and you can just be yourself. And it's a real joy to read. So should we begin at the beginning? Would you just, if you wouldn't mind, just speaking a little bit about, as much as you can, about the experience of losing your father, and particularly about some of the surprises and mysteries of the grief you felt after your father died?
Sure. So my father died in the fall of 2016, following not exactly an illness, but a kind of decline. He would have jokingly said decay or some such slightly off funny word, like old cheese or something. But my father was an incredibly gregarious, warm, generous person, which is to say he was very lively in the root sense. He was incredibly full of life and incredibly formative to my life, literally, obviously, but also figuratively, and to the life of my family, and frankly, to the life of every room he ever walked into. So it was very painful to lose him, as I honestly always knew it would be. I mean, I said earlier, I've always been afraid of losing people I love. And my father had been sick long enough that I had lived for a long time with the fear of losing him. And I say this in the book, but I somehow lived with the fear of losing him without ever for like 1 nanosecond thinking about like, well, what actually happens then after he dies? Like my imagination did not proceed beyond my own dread into like any practical realm at all, which maybe it's impassable until you're there. But I found grieving my father to be fascinating, which sounds clinical, and I don't mean it that way, but I couldn't have written about it if it hadn't been such a strange experience. It was not that I had never grieved before. I lost someone quite young at a quite formative age, and had been through grief in different incarnations, and I had some of the usual losses one does in life, a beloved grandmother, this kind of thing. But losing my father was a very specific and different kind of grief for me. And I suppose I could speak about many parts of it, but I think that possibly the part that was most surprising to me, and I write some about this in the book, but we don't often talk about grief in these terms, but I found it staggeringly boring. Like I just, which we think of grief as this incredibly dramatic emotion, and it is sometimes, right? I mean, I have certainly had the experiences, James, I imagine you have. I know you also have lost both parents, one quite recently. I'm sure many people in the audience are grappling with or have grappled with grief. There are obviously moments where it brings you to your knees. It really does. So I don't want to suggest that boring is like the only or the overriding feeling behind it. But, to me, it was eerily analogous to being in the hospital before he died, which is to say it's both you're terrified, you're incredibly sad, you're braced all the time. There are these major existential things going on. And yet in a kind of moment to moment way, there's a profound tedium, and I did feel that way about grief. I got bored with it. I was frustrated by the kind of emotion and richness and vitality to the world. And I didn't really like grieving me. Like me as a person in mourning was boring to me. My father was an extremely unboring person, so it seemed, not like a good way to honor his life. So yes, of all the many, many, many things I experienced in grief, I think that was the one that kind of took me back the most.
Yeah, and you write very interestingly about how in previous experiences of grief you had so-called bereavement hallucinations. You'd heard the voice of your great-grandmother, the voice of a friend, a 16-year-old friend who died when you were that age too. And it seemed logical that you would find your father in the same way, that out walking, he would suddenly, speak from behind a rock or something. And it didn't happen.
It did not, and it still has not. Yes, it's strange to me, actually. And I mean, just put it on the shelf with all the other millions of mysteries about the universe. Yes, I didn't know this term bereavement hallucination until I started actually kind of reading the literature on grief, but apparently it's incredibly common to hear or sense the presence of or even see a loved one after their death. And I had that experience really vividly, right? And really strangely. And it's not that I have a cosmology whereby the people I love persist as themselves, somewhere just vaguely inaccessible on the other side of some, cosmic curtain, and occasionally they parted and I can feel them. I don't believe that at all. And yet nonetheless, I've had the experience of like hearing voices in particular of people I love in ways that were just so clearly felt external to me, not a memory and not coming from my mind, but just like there in the room. In fact, quite strangely, I'd actually had that with my father when he was alive. I don't say this in the book, but I lived for a year in Santiago, Chile, and one morning woke up very early in the morning to the sound of my father calling my name quite urgently. And as it transpired, he had a heart attack that day, and it was fine. It's one of the many, things that might have killed him, but didn't for many, many years. But people have these experiences, and they're incredibly uncanny, and it's very hard not to take them very, very seriously, as if I had never had a nightmare that didn't come true or have any, manifestation in the world. But strangely, after my father died, I just nothing, just absolute universal blankness and silence. I love him dearly. I think about him all the time, and he's, the world sometimes summons him for me in various ways. My sister is amazing at channeling him. My mom obviously just chimes in at the exact right moment sometimes with like, well, what Daddy would have said, or he's brought to life for me, as they say, which is a ridiculous saying, from time to time, but never in that way that truly does just feel with like a brush against his essence in that uncanny way. It just hasn't happened, and I don't know why. I don't know. James, have you had this experience?
No, I haven't, and I haven't had them in. No, they haven't previously happened to me. I mean, my father died last year, but I haven't heard his voice, and I didn't hear my mother's either in 2000 after 2014 when she died. No, but I know exactly what you mean about. There's a lovely thread running right through the book, which is the consolation one gets from objects, that put me in mind of that lovely line into The Lighthouse when Woolf says, what would you have known was the spirit of Mrs. Ramsay? How would you have known the spirit of Mrs. Ramsay if you'd found, for instance, a crumpled glove pushed down the side of a sofa cushion and pulled it up and said, "This is hers"? That's and that sort of, that can be uncanny too in a strange way. And I know that there's a lovely line where you say, it's funny too, where you say that you have his wallet which you say is now safe as it never was when your father had it, because he was so absent-minded and was always losing it. And I can imagine that it's a different kind of visitation, but that just, you know, we haven't yet got to the stage of actually even emptying out my dad's house, but I think I'd like to take, you know, a coat of his, and I will sometimes wear that coat, and that will be some kind of communication.
Yeah, that feels like the sort of humble and mortal and inexplicable version of finding one's lost loved ones in the world. You know, I can't summon my father's voice out of the ether, but it's true. I have his wallet and a bag of sweaters of his, which are ginormous on me, but I occasionally wear one and occasionally think, well, maybe I'll get someone to turn them into something else. And I certainly have many kind of physical mementos of his life, all of which I treasure very much. And occasionally even those can sort of out of nowhere summon him in an unexpected way for me, which is always a real pleasure. Used to be occasionally full of grief, but now I more often find that those moments are full of joy.
Yeah. I love how also you write about this peculiar paradoxical thing of losing a parent, which is that on the one hand, you move forward temporally, so that you're next in line, of course, and there's all the usual feelings about mortality. And at the same time, you're moving backwards because you feel suddenly very childlike, and want that comfort that you might not actually have wanted as an adult for quite a, you know, you'd sort of forgotten it as an adult, you'd forgotten to need it as an adult, and then suddenly your parent dies and you want to be just that kid in the sick room, as it were. The, you know, mum comes in and dad comes in and says, here's some grapes and here's some, you know, fizzy water, and we'll look after you, and yeah, that's beautifully described in this first section.
Well, and I think, yes, you haven't experienced it in a long time as an adult when you lose a parent as an adult. So that's part of it. But I think also in an interesting way, loss of a parent does return you within the realm of memory, returns you to your childhood. Meaning, of course, I think about my father as my adult father, and we had a lovely adult relationship. He read everything I ever wrote, and I loved talking to him about books, and he was absolutely insatiable. I mean, I would mention a book in passing and he would go read it. James, you never reviewed everything that he didn't go read it, and then everything else the person had wrote. He loved to read, and he was, you know, really fun to just discuss life with. So I had a really robust and you know, constant ongoing adult relationship with him. But there is something about losing a parent that the terrain you revisit most deeply or most tenderly or something, it is childhood. You know, what I think of when I think of my father is my father reading me bedtime stories, you know, and my father on summer vacations with us when we were little, swimming with us. And it's strange because it's not that the adult version was less precious or less present to me, but I think there's something about the end of life that brings us back to its beginnings.
Yeah. The spirit that comes off the book in the first section of your father is one of great joy. His early childhood had been, unlike yours, far from easy. And I wonder if you just speak a little bit about that, and whether you write a little bit about it in the book, but whether you felt you ever sort of cracked the secret, as it were, if it is a secret, the enigma of his happiness.
I did not, and if I had, James, I would not be selling books. I would be, you know, bottling something, and I would be a billionaire in the snake oil industry. It's really fascinating what a happy person my father was, because you're right, the circumstances of his life did not in any obvious way conduce to happiness. He was, for those who haven't read the book, which I assume at this stage is everyone, my father's mother, my paternal grandmother, was the youngest of 13 children, who was sent off to Palestine. They were the family was living in Poland, on a shtetl in Poland, Jewish family, and she was sent off to Palestine when it became clear that the Second World War was about to make life in Poland unbearable for Jews. And her parents and all but her oldest of those 13 siblings perished in Auschwitz. And my father's family eventually, after actually quite a lot of loss and grief in Palestine and long and confusing travels along the way, wound up settling in Detroit. His parents' marriage was not a happy one. If it ever had been, it certainly wasn't after what they survived together. And it was also not a financially stable family. He lived in real poverty in Palestine, and a kind of brief respite after that, and then in a sort of on the edge of the working class in Detroit. And yet my father just somehow emerged from all of this with the most ebullient spirit you could ever possibly encounter. And I don't know how to explain that. And I wish I did. I certainly don't think that in any pat way, hard scrabble or difficult lives lead to, joyful people. That's disproved all around us every day. And I also don't wish difficulty and poverty on anyone. But yes, my dad just had this incredible spirit and kind of self-directedness. I mean, the other mystery of my father is like my father was authentically brilliant, spoke 7 languages, devoured every book he ever read, was just exceptionally bright across a sort of insane array of fields, none of which, or very few of which, he had anything approximating formal training in, except the law, which he ultimately settled in for a career. I will certainly say that one major contributor to his happiness later in life was my mother, who is an amazing, amazing woman and deserves her own book. But stabilized my dad in a lot of ways. I think my dad was happy, but not exactly what you might call directed in life until they met. And I also don't know that I think my father would have told you he didn't want children. And I think one of the great surprises of my father's life was, it turns out he probably loved being a father more than he loved almost anything. And that was all my father's doing. So, but the core question is absolutely mysterious to me. And I suppose it is the mystery of humankind in general. I have a new baby daughter. She's 5 months old. And I'll tell you, it's when she was 30 seconds old, I looked at her and I said, "Oh my goodness, you have so much equilibrium." Now, how did I know that about a child I had known for half a minute, right? And I could, of course, have been wrong, and I could still be wrong, but I'll tell you, for 5 months, she's been unbelievably serene and full of equilibrium and happy. So this is the mystery of existence, right? I have no idea why my father was happy. I have no idea if I'm right about my daughter, but if she is, like, where did she get it? I don't know. That core sort of essence of self is, to me, one of the probably 2 or 3 greatest mysteries of existence.
Well, I will say that one of the real pleasures of reading the book was the steady realization that it's a book about happiness, that it's a book about happiness even when it's a book about grief. And it's also a book about coming from a happy family. And that's sort of striking these days, very striking in Memoir, but striking anyway, because of all the, as you discuss in the book, the sort of this idea that, happiness writes white and all that sort of stuff, that it just doesn't, it doesn't have the color that you need. Not true. And it's lovely when the book shifts from shall we say, grief happiness into happy happiness, and to the found section. And this is just marvelous. And as I said at the beginning, I think that readers might find themselves even more moved by the descriptions of you finding love than the descriptions of you losing your father. Just would you mind just telling us a little bit about, if we're not sort of invading privacy too much, but just tell us a little bit about some of the kind of fairly wild differences on the surface between you and the person you eventually married.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think having written a memoir, I forfeit most of my right to privacy, so that's fine. I'm so grateful to you for identifying this as a book about happiness, because I think that's exactly right. And it was a great pleasure to me to write about the happy family I came from and the happy family that I'm making, and not boring at all to me, and I hope not to readers. So anyway, I'm grateful to you for saying that and for feeling that way. Yes. So I was vividly aware. I met my partner, Casey, who, let's just disclose right away, James knows her better than he knows me. So at some point I might have some interesting questions for you on this topic, but I met Casey, a mutual friend suggested we might enjoy each other's company. We lived, far away from each other, but she happened to be passing through the town where I lived at the time, up in the Hudson Valley. And so we had lunch. And it was immediately apparent to me, and this actually should have been the sign that I was about to fall in love with her, because I did sit there sort of mentally tabulating all the differences between us in a kind of anxious way, like, is this going to be a problem or is this going to be a problem? The obvious difference is, for one thing, I'm older than she is. She likes to joke that she was incredibly surprised. She had read my writing for a while. She's a fellow writer. She'd read my writing for a while, and originally with grave skepticism, because the first thing she ever read of mine was a not admiring piece about The Great Gatsby, a book that is a touchstone for her and which she greatly adores. So her opening position was that I was an abject idiot, and that she's gradually moved along from there. But so she had read my work, and she came to meet me for lunch, I think thinking that I was like 198 years old, some kind of like wizened creature of the literary establishment, and was a little surprised. I'm older than her, but not quite that much older than her. So that was the first difference. Obviously, we lived in different places, and it's not that it's, geographically so far away. Maryland and New York is not, New York and Indonesia. But we came from very, very different backgrounds. Despite my father's background, he did very well for himself, and I come from a kind of classic upper middle class suburban Jewish family background. I grew up in Shaker Heights, Ohio, one of the ritziest suburbs east of the Mississippi and possibly west of it as well. And I grew up a kind of secular Jew. And Casey, my partner, comes from a working class farming community. Neither of her parents went to college. And in a part of the country that, is technically below the Mason-Dixon line, and unlike the rest of Maryland, here on the Eastern Shore where she was born and raised, really shows it, right? And she's, grew up on a farm. I grew up in the, you name it. The sort of background differences were stark. Of those, I think initially, religion probably felt like the starkest difference. And it does not say good things about me that I felt that way. It's funny, in childhood, actually, one of my closest friends was the child of a minister, and it never seemed, in the context of a kid friendship, a difference like that never seemed relevant. But, you grow up and you start moving in these increasingly sort of homogenous circles in some ways, or circles that seem homogenous. I mean, as it turns out, I think all of our lives are full of a lot more difference than we necessarily realize. But I had not previously been so close, and not close on the kind of terms that that involve really imagining a future and a family together, with someone who was sincerely devout. Casey's a devout Lutheran. She at one point very seriously considered going into the ministry. She'd worked as a hospital chaplain, and it was just great for me, to be honest. I think it's very easy, and look, to be clear, I blame Christianity for this as much as I do, us heretical atheists. But it's very easy to be really dubious about institutional religion in this country, especially if you have an identity, Jewish, female, lesbian, intellectual that has been, not, let us say, embraced by it with any consistency. But it was really wonderful to fall in love with a devout Christian who was just, frankly, like blisteringly smarter than I am, and an incredible, I don't want to say defender of her faith, because she's not defensive about it at all, but incredible at articulating what it means to her, and why it feels valuable and beautiful to her. So yes, I would say the difference between us that seems starkest is also the one I probably cherish the most.
I love how frankly romantic.
Both because you know Casey, and because from complicated relationships to Christianity.
Yes. Well, perhaps I should disclose at this point that, yes, I taught Casey when she was an undergraduate at Harvard. So actually there was an extra deliciousness to reading this book, because I could sort of almost think myself into it. I almost became the matchmaker, even though I didn't have anything to do with it. But because I'd
That was
known
a
her before
delightful
you
story.
met her, it was almost as if well, one of the reasons I was able to think myself the matchmaker is that you do a lovely thing in the second section, which is in a way akin to, it's akin to sort of describing two small figures at either side of a, I don't know, icy lake or something, and slowly, as from a drone above, you can see that they're coming towards each other, and this may take, you know, many years, but eventually they're going to meet right in the middle of the frozen lake. And you prepare us for that, but you also believe in it in some way. You believe that there can be such a thing as love at first sight, and I think you believe romantically in a way that is heartening, that people really can find, people who are destined for each other can find each other, and I think that's fantastic. I mean, I like that a lot. It reminds me of when I teach Pride and Prejudice, and I think Casey was in that class. That when I teach Pride and Prejudice, I like to ask the students, why does Elizabeth get Darcy wrong at the beginning of the book and then continue to get him wrong until she gets him right, morally speaking, you know? And they're all being good students, so they all answer with the proper sort of things. They say, well, she's got the wrong amount of pride, or she's prejudiced, or she has partial information, she's easily swayed. And it's very hard to get them to answer to give the simple answer, which is because she's in love with him from the very beginning. All you have to do is watch Philadelphia Story to know how it goes. She can't get him right. She can't see him properly because she's the moment she actually met him, it was like that. And I just love the way you seem to believe in that, and write about it. You embrace it romantically.
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously have complicated feelings about it because I spend quite a number of pages saying, well, how could this possibly be, right? It seems irrational and also not necessarily a good thing to, you know, commit your life to, you know, nothing about. But, you know, to me, it's akin to you asked me this question of how was my father a happy person? And it's like, I have no idea. It feels utterly mysterious. How do you meet someone and know, you know, not necessarily at first sight, but in minutes or hours, that there is something incredibly potent and substantive and precious there that you haven't encountered before? I have no idea, but I can tell you that within, I mean, the same day that I met Casey, I thought, boy, I guess the best way I can say it is I had this kind of deep inner assent, like, yes, you know, just a kind of yesness toward her. And for sure, I described this in the book, but we had a kind of comically long second date. And by long, I mean like 19 days. But it's somewhere, you know, in the middle of that, Casey was away in New York City for the day. And I called my sister and I said, I met the woman I'm going to marry. Mm-hmm. So I did have incredible clarity and certainty about that. And I can't describe it, but I certainly can't and would not deny it. Mm. And so far, so good, right? I mean, she's amazing. We're incredibly happy. We have a beautiful little daughter. So I don't feel that I stumbled into some, you know, trap laid for me by the fates.
No, though you do, though part of the last section and the bit you read from is very eloquent on that. When you knit together finally these two strongest of feelings that we have in life, you show how they depend on each other, need each other, that, you know, you can't have grief without loving someone, and you can't love someone without opening yourself up to I was going to say the possibility, the inevitability of loss. And I'm sure, certainly speaking for myself and you know, as a parent, I'm sure that you're having a new child, and the way you introduce that child at the end of the book is yet another element of that sort of the terror of loss, that to do this thing of bringing a child into the world is to open yourself up to what Norman Rush calls the thin places, the sort of suddenly the world becomes dangerously thin, and you open yourself up to the possibility of all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Look, I mean, my daughter brings me a kind and probably also a quantity of joy I could never express, and even with all the joy in my life, I'm not sure I experienced before. It's really marvelous and incredible. She's just a delight, and it feels it really does feel like a kind of honor and a very sacred duty to let her sort of unfurl into who she is. And I love doing it at every moment. But yeah, I mean, I said I'm someone who worries about the people I love. Well, oh my goodness, you bring home this like tiny little 8-pound creature from the hospital. And I mean, I'll tell you, in a funny way, I actually worry about a lot less in a day-to-day way than I thought I would. I thought I'd be one of these parents, because I am a worrywart. I thought I'd be one of these parents who was like creeping into her bedroom to make sure she's breathing at night. And in fact, and again, I think this is partly something that radiates off of her. I have had this deep and unshakable sense from the beginning of my child is fine, like she's deeply fine. And yet there have been just a handful of moments where something actually made me worry in like the grave way of like, what if something is terribly, terribly wrong?
Right.
I'll tell you, I went from fine to imagining a level of distress that is terrifying even to imagine. The engine between zero and a grief I can't even articulate tonight because it's terrifying to do so. It's like, in 3 seconds I was there with her, maybe 0.3 seconds. So yes, it's of course terrifying. On the other hand, I mean, this is the bargain, right? Like you can't choose against this incredible kind of love. You have to take it with what it comes with, which is sometime, hopefully 180 years from now, an expiration date.
Yes, absolutely. Kathryn, if it's okay with you, I'll open up the Q&As.
By all means.
And see if there are 6 questions. Well, here's a nice question, which was, what was your father's favorite book?
I hate to answer that with tremendous authority, because my father, as I said, was a voracious reader in many languages and took a lot of delight from many books. But I think he would probably sanction me saying Middlemarch. One of the many things which my dad read probably 6 times in his adult life at a minimum. And one of the many things that I loved about my father is that he was an authentic and kind of automatic champion of the intellect of women. And in fact, one of the most moving things that happened during his memorial service was a female colleague of his stood up and said, I just want to say at every moment of my career, he was just there. He was just there as a defender against anyone who felt like I shouldn't be doing what I was doing or was lesser in any way. And that was just my dad. I mean, he really, he neither saw himself nor permitted in others any distinction based on anything but sheer kind of goodness, moral goodness, intellectual goodness, you name it. So anyway, he loved Middlemarch, thought George Eliot was a genius, which, let's be honest, George Eliot was a genius. One of his final acts, actually, this was both in the kind of and spirit of my book, the spirit of emotional conjunction. A very bittersweet thing about my father's death is, so my dad belonged to an all-male book club in Cleveland, which my mother had to talk him into joining, because my dad actually had this kind of strong feeling of, I don't want to be a part of an organization that for some reason thinks women should not be a part of it, especially an intellectual one. This is absolute nonsense. On the other hand, it was an incredible book club. It was like, Cleveland is actually in many ways a very, a city very friendly to the arts. It's got an incredible art museum, an incredible symphony. There were all these amazing people in it. And my mom was like, get over yourself. Like, segregated spaces exist in ways that are good in our culture too. And it's fine. And actually book clubs weirdly are often segregated by gender. I've subsequently learned self-segregated in some way. But anyway, my mom pushed him into this book club, which he then loved and relished. And it was great in all kinds of ways. Nor were their boundaries so strong that they didn't let me, come drop in when I was in town or whatever. But my father spent a decade trying to get this book club to read Middle Large. And there was just always something else they were going to read. And he was like, you guys, you dumb idiots, you've got to read this book. And they finally agreed to read it. And then they postponed that meeting because he was in the hospital and he died before we got to it. So the first book they read after my father's death was Middlemarch. And it's both tragic that he wasn't there to relish it, and yet so touching to me that was the way they marked his absence from the group permanently.
Yeah. A couple of other questions, which I can flow together. Was the writing experience helpful for your mourning process? And do you find that book talks revive feelings of grief for you? Do you ever find these topics suddenly difficult to talk about?
Well, to the first part of that, no. I mean, I think that I would not describe the writing of this book as cathartic. And as I said earlier, the ways that it was difficult were quite honestly writerly and intellectual, not emotional and not related to grief for the most part. Although when I found the beginning so incredibly hard to write, I did take a day to think, is there some, would a psychologist say otherwise, right? Is there some reason I cannot write this? But ultimately I do actually think it was a kind of writer's problem. No, the truth is I think I had worked through the emotion of losing my father, which that sounds incredibly glib, and of course it's dumb, right? I feel my father's loss ongoingly in all kinds of ways, in some ways especially now that I have a daughter of my own. So I don't mean to suggest that grief is a road that comes to a T somewhere and you've just hit the end of it. Of course it's not like that, but I do feel like in terms of what I wanted to write about in the book, I had already experienced it and thought about it and kind of figured out how I felt about it before I sat down to try to put it on the page in a way that worked for this book and that I could convey to readers. So no, it was not an act of catharsis, and nor was it upsetting to write. It's an interesting question about the kind of publicity and about book talks like this one. My book is 2 days old. It was born yesterday. So even younger than my daughter. So I suppose I don't know the answer yet. I'm not yet finding it to be emotionally difficult. In fact, if anything, it feels sweet to me to bring my father into the world. And it's been very meaningful to me when people have reacted to the book, chiefly as a means to its characters. There's no reaction I would prefer from a reader than, oh, I loved your father, or, oh, your partner seems amazing. Like I don't really care if people like the book, but I really very much hope that they like the main characters in it because I love them quite desperately. So right now it feels joyful and sweet and a way to bring my father into a lot of other people's lives, but I don't know the answer to that. Could change.
Did you by the way, it suddenly occurred to me because I was trying in the summer to write a bit of memoir myself, and last summer, and that was a little odd because in order to do that, I had to write about my father in the past tense. He died in October, but I raised that because I suddenly wondered when you were embarking on. When you knew, okay, I want to make the piece into a book, I want to write a memoir. Were there any memoirs that you turned to? Did you feel, okay, I know where I'm going, I'll do it without any sort of exemplary help? Or were there memoirs that you thought, oh, I'll just have another look and see how she does that?
I'm going to answer that question, but I want to say something about the past tense first, because I think, James, you'll appreciate it because you think about writing as closely as I do. One of the things that was very hard to let go of from that original essay is that essay does not open with the death of my father. It opens with my father very much alive and losing things left and right, which was how my father lived. He was incredibly absent-minded. And the turn, the moment when that essay darkens, I won't quote the sentence exactly right, but it's something like, my father, in addition to being absent-minded and menschy and brilliant, is dead. there was a way that in the essay, my father died almost in real time. and it almost let me stay in the present tense. And it was very, very hard to let go of that move. And I think some of that was about like, but I've moved on, 3 more years have passed, and I have to relegate this entire experience to the past. So in an interesting way, I do think that was kind of an emotionally challenging part of the writing, to speak to the earlier question. In terms of other memoirs, it's so funny. I did sit down and read a bunch of memoirs before I started writing this, mostly out of a sense of frankly, probably to procrastinate, but also out of a sense of doing my due diligence. I was not terribly well read in the genre of memoir. I had a lot of fun reading within memoir, but I cannot say that much in there felt like a model to me, in part because I was writing about happiness. And as you mentioned kind of in passing earlier, it's not famously a theme in memoirs and contemporary memoirs for the most part.
Right.
You'll probably appreciate, James, and I think it's obvious from the book itself, in some ways the most central book I read, not exactly as a guide, but as a book to be in conversation with, was C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which is about the death of his wife, and a beautiful and evocative and interesting and difficult, not difficult in the kind of dense sense, but emotionally very difficult book about a very kind of close-up experience of grief. But it's also very clearly a book about wrestling with one's faith, right? In some ways, that's much more the substance of that book than wrestling with grief, which is wrestling with the problem of, how do I maintain faith in Christianity and in this other thing that's completely central to my life, when I've lost this other thing that's central, and Christianity turns out to be offering me absolutely no consolation whatsoever. So that was it was an interesting book for me, because I was in some ways conscious that the project I was embarked on was wholly secular, while also trying to reckon with these really fundamentally existential questions and cosmological questions. So I thought quite a lot about our friend C.S. Lewis while writing this.
It's funny you should say that. It seems to me a deeply secular book, and in some ways a wonderful I wouldn't say reply to Lewis, because as you say, Lewis has his own perhaps strange ways of going about things, given his actual Christian piety. He was shocked by what happened to him, but it seems to me a deeply secular book, and I was very grateful for that. I think we've run out of time. This was, we could have gone on much longer. Really, we could. So I'm sorry we can't, but thank you very much, Kathryn, for writing this book and for sharing it with us tonight.
Thank you so much for the conversation, James. It's true, I would happily sit here and talk to you another 3 hours, but we should let these poor Bostonians go back to whatever the Bostonians are going back to. Or I guess you probably are all over the place, audience. Thank you again for coming to join us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And just a quick thank you to you both, Kathryn and James. Thanks to everyone out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about this book and purchase Lost and Found at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and everybody please stay safe. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.